All right, so we are going to finish up forensic DNA. This is your final PowerPoint, and this is PowerPoint number 3 on forensic DNA analysis. Okay, so in this PowerPoint, I'm going to talk about CODIS. And if you can remember back to the physical evidence unit, yeah, my dogs are fighting again, of course. One of the things we mentioned was, what is a database or what is a, repository? So we had mentioned AFIS, which is the automated fingerprint identification system, that there are databases for shoe prints and tire prints and, cartridge cases and bullets and things like that. So CODIS is the database for DNA profiles. And CODIS stands for Combined DNA Index System. So the Combined DNA Index System is basically, it's the United States National DNA Database, though searches can be done internationally via Interpol, and not only CODIS, but also VICAP, FYI. And this database and the computer software was created by the FBI. So, not typical citizens cannot just, log into CODIS. You have to be an accredited crime laboratory to be able to log into this database. So, very secure software. So the legislation for CODIS was established by Congress because as DNA was being developed, it became very apparent that this was going to be a great way for investigative leads to be developed. So one of the most powerful ways that DNA can be used is if the same person is leaving DNA behind at crime scenes. And really think of specifically of pattern cases, such as, serial offenders. So, a lot of serial killers have a sexual motive and they can leave DNA evidence behind, whether it's in the form of semen or otherwise. But one of the great things about DNA is it allows those cases to hit to each other. So basically, law enforcement now knows that it's the same person committing these offenses. Now, they may not be able to put a name on that person yet, but it's really helpful to know that, okay, all of these cases are connected. So now we can pool our resources, agencies can start working together. So they're providing investigative leads. The person who was the main inspiration for CODIS to be developed was who we consider the gold standard of serial killers in the United States. Really sad that we have a gold standard, but was Ted Bundy. And actually in 1987, I know way before you guys were born, but I did an internship with the FBI in between my years of my master's program in 1987. And one of the things that the interns had to do, or not had to do, that we were privileged to do, was to hear speakers from various members of the Bureau. And one of the talks that we were able to attend was the then acting director talking about CODIS. And I remember him saying that there are 3 words why the CODIS system is necessary, and those words were Theodore Robert Bundy. Okay, because if you remember Ted Bundy started out in the Seattle area, and then he moved on to Utah. Hey, girls, to go to law school, and then he went up to Colorado, ended up in Florida. So there were all these cases, and really the only reason that he was tracked was because there was a detective with King County, which is outside Seattle, and he felt that Ted was the guy. And so even when he retired, he kind of made it his purpose to track him around the country and let agencies know that he was there. If he hadn't chosen to do that, none of these agencies probably would have been able to connect these cases because DNA was not in existence and we didn't have CODIS. So, that it's really to help track down the Ted Bundys. And that can be serial homicide, that can be serial rape, it can be repeated burglaries where the person perhaps leaves DNA, cuts him or herself in the commission of a burglary. And of course, that becomes important because often those people can escalate to sexual assault and then potentially homicide. So CODIS began in 1990 as a pilot project, and finally, in 1994, federal legislation was passed, and the name of this was the DNA Identification Act of 1994. Okay, and this allowed for CODIS to be established, and it did three things, which have been modified a little bit. It was a good basis, but unfortunately there were lots of loopholes. So the biggest one was, number one, it allowed collection of samples and then having the DNA profiles of persons convicted of certain crimes on record, and that they had to remain in the database. That's the one where there were the biggest loopholes, okay? Also, it allowed crime labs to be able to upload DNA samples that were recovered from crime scenes. So, think of whether it's a burglary, whether it is an unknown male profile from a sexual assault case, and then also potentially identify people who have never been claimed, they're unidentified, and maybe they're homeless people that are not in a missing persons database, but at least their DNA profiles will be on file. The goal is that there are no unclaimed, unidentified bodies, okay? That would be the ultimate goal. So here is the main problem with CODIS and when it first started out, and thankfully this has been rectified. Okay, so when CODIS began, the only people that had to give up samples were people who were convicted of the following crimes. Okay, first-degree murder. Now notice, not second degree. Okay, rape, sexual assault, burglary, possession of burglary tools, or possession of child pornography. Okay, now all of those are important. However, here is a loophole. Okay, so say for example, someone is charged in a rape homicide, and as I mentioned, a lot of cases don't go to trial. They are, the defense and the prosecution meet together, they plea bargain. So let's say that the prosecution says, okay, if your client pleads to second-degree murder, we will drop the rape charge, okay, because it'll guarantee that they will serve more time. Okay, sounds great on paper. However, notice that conviction for second-degree murder, now that person who was involved in a rape homicide did not have to give a sample for CODIS, okay? So you were missing a lot of offenders. I do think the burglary, possession of burglary tools, and of course, people who possess child pornography, absolutely great to have them in the database, and that remains. So now things have improved, okay? So currently, collection of DNA samples is mandatory in all 50 states for really most felony crimes, and it's including sexual assaults and homicides, which is great. 47 states also require DNA samples to be taken from all convicted felons. Okay, many states also collect DNA from people who have been arrested. Now, some people have a big problem with that, okay? And one of the things that I want to make you aware of is that if your DNA sample is collected, let's say, hey, you're a person of interest, but we just kind of want to rule you out, and you're innocent, so you give up a DNA sample. If that's brought into the crime lab and then compared to samples, a lot of times it remains in the database, okay? So, keep that in mind. And actually the person who gave up the DNA profile has to hire a lawyer and then have it expunged from the database. And so a lot of people don't know that, okay? So it's kind of a sneaky way of, potentially saying, okay, we don't think that you did this crime or you've been excluded for this crime, but maybe there's something else in there, so we'd like to keep you in the database. People who are really into civil liberties probably would not be cool with that. Just wanted to let you know. Of course, if you're in law enforcement, I mean, my DNA is in CODIS because I worked DNA cases, and it's mostly to see if, God forbid, if there's any future contamination of a case that was in the Chicago, Illinois State Police lab, they could at least screen my DNA and everyone else who works there to see if it was potential contamination, instead of thinking, oh, this was an alternate, person who was actually involved in the crime. But I don't plan on committing any crime, so I don't care that my DNA is in database and that my fingerprints are in APHIS forever. It's kind of something that if you're going into law enforcement, you kind of have to realize that and kind of give up that freedom. But if you're not planning on becoming a career criminal, what do you have to worry about? So DNA also, if a judge orders it, DNA can be collected from someone convicted of any crime, and also juveniles. Okay, and that's great because juveniles, their DNA is not going to change during their lifetime. So if they become an adult offender, it's still going to match. One of the examples of any other crime, so there was a case in Chicago, and I did not work this case, but it was a juvenile who set a German Shepherd puppy on fire because the dog had refused to fight in a dog fight, and that made this juvenile angry. Okay, and luckily the prosecutor argued to the judge that if this person is going to set a puppy on fire, first of all, animal cruelty is one of the great indicators of future criminality, and that this is someone we would want to keep an eye on because they have great potential to potentially escalate to other crimes against humans, and the judge agreed. Boom, now that juvenile's DNA is in CODIS. So, if the prosecutor can make a case for it, then potentially anyone can have their DNA put in. So CODIS has 3 levels in its system, and they are referred to by the acronyms LDIS, ESDIS, and NDIS. So it's basically, you have a local DNA database, then you have one at the state level for all 50 states, and then you have one for the United States as a whole. Okay. Also want to mention that private DNA testing labs, though they may be accredited, they do not have access to CODIS. So it's only fully accredited crime labs that are officially part of a law enforcement agency. So first of all, let's talk about the local level, okay? So this is where each individual crime lab in a state will upload profiles from their cases, okay? So say, for example, an analyst is working a sexual assault case that doesn't have a suspect, and they, find a male profile from the sexual assault kit, and whether it matches a suspect or not, or the profile is unknown, that can be uploaded into LDIS. And they can also upload suspect profiles. Okay, so for example, the lab that I used to work at, which was the Illinois State Police Forensic Science Center at Chicago, all of the different analysts who were working their cases would upload their profiles into our LDIS system, and then a search would be done. And what this could tell us is, because that was a large lab, you have a lot of DNA people working, we don't have time to sit and chat about all of our cases. This would tell us if perhaps 2 cases within the lab were connected, or even better, what if a case that didn't have a suspect connected to a local case that did have a suspect that matches? Now you've solved 2 cases, okay? But it was within just our lab only. That's what LDIS is. Then, okay, yep, the postman's here. Very exciting, okay. The next level then is at the state, okay? So the state database contains the eligible profiles from all local labs in that same state, plus the DNA profiles of convicted offenders in that state's prison system. Okay, what's great about CODIS now is any person who basically has been convicted of a felony, before they are released from prison, they have to give up a cheek swab, their DNA has to be processed, and it has to be in the database before they can be released. And the great part is, guess what? They have to pay for it, okay? So it's not the taxpayers paying for that. So at the state system, for example, we have an Illinois State Police Crime Lab in Springfield, Illinois. There's one, there are labs all over the state of Illinois, and of course in Chicago where I worked. So all of the different labs in Illinois, once a month, upload all of their profiles to the state system, and then there's a state search. So this shows, hey, maybe we have a case from Carbondale, which is down in the southern part of the state, and it's connecting to a case up in Chicago. Okay, so now Carbondale PD and Chicago PD can start talking to each other and saying, okay, is this a long distance trucker? Is this someone who lives in both locations? That's what we call investigating or generating an investigative lead. Also, perhaps you have a case that doesn't have a suspect, but now it hits to a convicted offender, and now you've basically solved that case. Okay, so that's what can happen at the state level. The national level then is pooling all of the DNA profiles, including convicted offenders and case DNA profiles, and searching them all together. So it's this massive search, and this is where you can connect cases that, okay, this person has been committing sexual assaults and they started in Maine, and then they went to Vermont, and then to South Carolina, and then they ended up in California. So it allows agencies to be able to know where their cases are hitting to, okay? So, for God's sakes, do not memorize any of these numbers. I just want to give you an example of how huge these numbers are. Okay, so the National DNA Index has over 14 million convicted offender profiles, and certainly that is growing every day. It has about 4 million arrestee profiles, and case profiles were reaching the 1 million mark. Okay, so these are from actual cases that are worked. And this was October of last year, so you can imagine these numbers certainly have grown. So this is the way it works. LDIS, you have all of the local labs within a state, and they search just within their lab to see if any local cases are connected. Okay, then they upload their profiles to SDIS, and this is at the level of the state. So here you're getting all of the case profiles up here, plus this is where you can search convicted offenders from that particular state. And then each SDIS goes up to NDIS. So here you're finding convicted offender profiles throughout the United States of America, and I believe Puerto Rico as well. And then all of the case eligible forensic profiles. So, any profiles from actual crimes that have been committed are uploaded as well. And the purpose is, let's find those Ted Bundys, okay? Let's try to connect these profiles so we know, is there one person who's committing multiple offenses, either within the same city, within the same state, or from state to state within the United States. So when a profile matches in CODIS, we refer to those as hits, okay? And the system's hits are tracked as either they are a convicted offender hit, okay? And this is where an unknown case profile hits to a convicted offender sample, and so now we know the name and identity of the potential suspect who committed that offense. Or it's a forensic hit, and this is where profiles from 2 or more crime scenes are linked, but potentially we don't know the source of these profiles. Okay, so for example, before Ted Bundy was known, his murders would have been connected via forensic hits. They would have known, okay, this is the same guy, now who is he? Okay, when he was arrested and convicted, then his profile would have been put into CODIS as a convicted offender. And so potentially, hopefully, if those profiles from unknown cases were entered into CODIS, perhaps they hit to Bundy's profile, and then you can potentially solve some other cases. Okay, so that's the difference between an offender hit and a forensic hit. Okay. Additionally, we use this terminology. So you can have a warm hit or a cold hit. A warm hit is where you kind of know what's coming, and it's where detectives, and remember, crimes are solved by good police work, by good detective work. All right, DNA helps, but it's not the end all be all. Okay, so this is where detectives think, you know what, we think these two cases are linked. They don't have a suspect, but maybe they're showing the same MO or signature trademark behavior. And when they hit in the database, it's kind of not a surprise because the detectives suspected that they were going to hit anyway. Okay, so that's what we call a warm hit. What's really exciting is what we call a cold hit, where it's totally unexpected, where, as an analyst, you have a case where you've generated an unknown profile, you're entering it into CODIS, and then boom, you get a notification that, hey, guess what? This is hitting to another case where there also is no suspect. Or even better, hey, this hit to a convicted offender, and now there is a real viable suspect of who, we believe, committed this. Maybe it's a cold case. Maybe it's a cold case murder. So the cold hit, totally unexpected. And this is where DNA actually can solve crimes. And it shows kind of the power of that system because, no idea that cases are connected or that this particular offender was involved in this. And boop, now you have a cold hit that shows that that is actually the indication. So once again, do not memorize these numbers. They're just there to kind of, give you an indication of how many profiles are out there. So we went over these numbers before. What else is that CODIS has produced almost, and I'm sure it's over this number, 500,000 investigative leads, and has assisted over 500,000 investigations. Okay, so letting them know that this is the same person committing this. In Iowa, so Iowa only has one crime lab, and it's located in Ankeny. I believe, maybe I have that location. I always call it the Des Moines lab, but I'm not sure the actual city. I believe it's Ankeny. So in Iowa, we think of Iowa not being very populous, but lo and behold, we have, certainly what I'm sure is over 130,000 convicted offender profiles. We do not put people who have just been arrested but not convicted of a crime into the database, which I agree with. I think that's actually fair and a good thing because we're not assuming that they're going to be an offender in the future. In terms of case profiles, I'm sure now over 8,000. We only have one lab, so we only have one lab that's participating in national searches. But even with Iowa, which is not very populous, nearly 3,000 investigative leads have been generated. And so, that's kind of the power of CODIS. Okay, yay, we're done with forensic DNA. That's it.